All set. All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right. So this morning we are going to talk about red teaming the board, or bringing some red team techniques for those that are familiar with the process to the broader business perspective, to the executive table, to senior leadership, to management pillars throughout an organization. And we're going to talk about why we need to do that, what the current state of how security is currently functioning within organizations, and then some techniques, tactics, etc., for how we can get to how we can start to apply some of these bridge the gap things into the business sense to get more of what we actually want to do. So really quick, who am I? So I run the trust and security team at a company called Nuna. We are a healthcare analytics company based out of San Francisco. And as of about 2 days ago, I landed here drove here from San Francisco out here and just officially completed my move here. So rock on. And I was a former red team director at Cigital, so I used to do a lot of very hands-on technical red teaming where it was more, the black mask, social engineering, break into stuff, hacking a lot of things, all of that. And so I got a lot of perspective around working with a bunch of different companies and seeing how red teaming works in the financial services sector, to the healthcare sector, to insurance, et cetera, to see what things are of concern to those types of industries. And then I got to start applying a lot of this to more culture building and all of that in my current role at Nuna. And for anyone that knows me, or as you'll see throughout this, I'm a little bit of a fanatic. This is actually me in a full Batman suit and one of my bosses or former boss's kids. I think weighs about 40 pounds for anyone who's curious. All right. So really quickly. So agenda for today. So as I'm sure really quick show of hands. Is anyone here familiar with or has participated in any kind of red team assessment in their current day-to-day work? Awesome. So for those of you who do this, and for those of you who are probably just following along or who are interested in or reading alongside red team topics or social engineering topics, we know that penetration testing and red teaming is a great way to just blow the lid off of some problem that has not yet been explored, or to call HDMI. I do have adapters. Sure. I don't have adapters handy. All right. Stand by. Mac.
You also got to keep moving. That's why you use wired mics, or you pop on stage. You speak about it. Sorry about the inconvenience.
Oh, it's all good.
I would do that all on the internet too.
We good? Okay. All right. Cool. So we all know that red teaming and pen testing is a great way to call a lot of attention really quickly to something that has not yet been explored. But I have this working hypothesis that one of the reasons that we continuously fall short in the organizations we're working with or in is that we end up using a very different language in the way that we measure risk, the way that we test things, the things that we're concerned about. For obvious reasons, we all work in security. Everyone else works in an organization in their own particular specialty, assess risk, what kinds of things that we look at. And so, getting ourselves out of that bubble and really starting to expand our thinking is going to be one of the big themes of this talk. And so one of the first things that I want to touch on here is figuring out what is actually important to the organizations that we're working with. So everyone here has probably seen, or if you have not seen these particular acronyms. KPI is Key Performance Indicator, and OKR is Objective and Key Results. These are basically management speak for what the hell are we going to do, and how are we going to do it. And if we're not measuring things or talking about things in the same kind of language, or at least giving senior executives ammo that they need to achieve the things that they've documented and come out publicly saying they're going to do, then we're going to find ourselves coming up short in some ways. The next thing, and this will be, I'll focus on 3 particular tactics that I've seen applied successfully and have applied successfully in terms of actually bringing red team techniques into these management and executive circles. And the first being business process reviews. So you could think about this as threat modeling or some kind of adversarial analysis for a business process, whether it's new user onboarding, user offboarding, access management, et cetera, et cetera. There's a million business processes that run the organizations that we all work in. And then doing war games. So a red team, or the way that information security, the industry typically thinks about red teaming. I'm going to get a little mobile if I can. So the way that information security typically approaches red teaming is more of an active assessment or emulation of, some set of adversaries against a particular system. It's usually an organization or some big app like Chase.com or something. We're just going to go after, Chase's primary banking platform. And what I want to introduce here is basically bringing that same kind of adversary emulation technique to business strategies, and getting senior executives to think about the same kinds of things that we think about and getting them engaged, because when they're engaged, we can start to drive our agenda more effectively. And then the last thing is spreading the love that we all, we come to these conferences, we talk a lot, we learn a lot, and we're really quickly advancing the state of our internal state of security. But at the same time, we're not really doing a great job as an industry of sharing that knowledge outside of the bubble of security professionals. And so what I want to propose is that getting other people engaged and interested and involved in your organizations will help drive them to you for advice. They'll start asking you for questions. They'll start asking if this particular thing is okay, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all of the stuff that we actually want. It does take more time, but it's all the stuff we want in order to make sure that they are thinking in a way that's going to protect, they don't click on that link. They don't do that dumb thing that ends up putting the organization at risk. And then lastly, and this is a big theme that's been just emerging in security team agendas or CISO agendas around the field, is we want to be able to turn security into a competitive advantage for our organization. Most of the time, as you all know, security and IT and other internal service organizations are cost centers within an organization. So all they do is take more budget. They always want more budget because there's always more risk to reduce, and they don't actually lead to any increase in bottom line for the organization that they're servicing. And so instead of consistently being the team that is pointing out problems and saying no, we want to gain trust with the senior executives that we're working with, the other department heads that we're working with, and we want to be able to help enable them to do their jobs more effectively. So even though we're not bringing in dollars, we're helping them earn more dollars and more effectively and safely. And so you probably all are asking yourself, first off, who really cares? So when I first came out of consulting, I asked myself this same kind of question. I tried to approach everything from a very technical perspective, and I had this reflection moment very, very frequently about who really cares about all of this business stuff. It doesn't really serve my ends immediately. The means don't lead to the ends that I want. And so I had to really challenge myself to break that line of thinking. And basically the primary objective that we were shooting for here is getting people engaged and interested and fascinated with security. And we want people thinking about how security may potentially negatively or positively impact the projects that they're working on. So for instance, I'll use an example that we had at Nuna. Getting some of our department heads or business line leaders involved and engaged in this, through these kind of processes. We have them coming to us at the very start of, and not by some kind of organization-wide mandate, but we have them coming to us at the very start of their projects, and they want to weave in to every single sprint, every single story planning activity, some kind of security requirement. They want to weave in particular security features along the way. They want to make sure that they have all of the compliance checks that they need before the product goes out the door. They want to make sure that they engage folks with, or engage with penetration testers to get results and bugs and all of that. And so ultimately what we were trying to drive for is getting our users and our department heads interested in what we're trying to get them interested in, because at the end of the day, most security teams cannot scale or cannot keep up to the kind of scale that we actually need to service the organizations that we are. All right. So really quickly, reflection time. Where do we stand today? So as I mentioned, and as you all very well know, security is a cost center. I mentioned this before, but we are very, very focused on technology and social issues, and social issues to the extent that people are clicking on links. We know social engineering is bad, phishing is rampant, all of that. But beyond that, we don't really embrace the social factor. And then in a lot of cases, we talk about and we frame issues as though ours should always take precedent. And so this is one thing that we've been in pretty heated debates internally at Nuna in terms of, I'll use an example. I'll use another example just to drive the point home. A few members of our team felt very strongly that we should completely block off any kind of work from international locations. There was a really big, with all of the stories emerging about, like the CBP and border protection, seizing laptops, forcing people to get into them, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of talk about, well, our laptops, anytime somebody travels, they're automatically going to be backdoored, et cetera, et cetera. And so we should just completely block off any kind of international travel, full stop. But working in San Francisco and having a very diverse, employee base as we do, that would be a huge, huge, huge business disruptor. And so we can't just full stop say nobody can work internationally. And so we end up having these kind of discussions that, we have to start framing things in a business context in terms of how much is that actually going to cost us in productivity loss? Is there a better, smarter way to potentially remediate the risk? And so now we just end up giving people Chromebooks and we let them have access to certain non-PHI apps for instance, like you get access to your corporate services via Chromebook or something like that. And that is the way that you work internationally. And then everything else, you may have to go through a bastion or something like that. But anyways, this is basically how I ended up when I first joined Nuna. This was essentially how I kind of burst onto the scene in terms of it was a small startup. They had a few products out there already. There was all sorts of technical risk, as you might imagine, with an emerging company. And there was a lot of just technical risk to be remediated. And unfortunately, none of the vulnerabilities that I could really bring to the table could actually be remediated. If you started to dig in and shave the yak, if you will, a lot of these systems weren't necessarily redeployable instantaneously. They couldn't be maintained in an agile way, in the sense that if we wanted to bring something down, patch it, bring it back up, or apply some code level patch, that we could instantaneously do that. And so in order for the organization and engineering teams to facilitate the requests that I had to start fixing vulnerabilities, they would have to carve out weeks of their time to, just to make simple changes. And from a business perspective, it really forced us into say, well, what's the real likelihood that this particular thing is going to get, that this risk is going to be actualized? And what, if that risk does get actualized, how much will it realistically cost us? Because this is basically what ended up happening to me when I when I came in like this, I ended up like that. And I know that has happened to a lot of, in talking to peers and all of that, peers and friends in the industry. I know that's happened to a lot of different folks, especially those working in a consulting capacity. We have this tendency to just burst onto the scene like, the experts, kick the door down and, we start just like lighting up reports and shooting PDFs all over the place. And we're saying, all of these things are wrong. And so go fix them all. And what happens most of the time is whoever's running the show, they'll start shipping said PDFs out, around the company. They'll say, "Oh yeah, that's great," and nothing will end up happening with it, which is really unfortunate. And that is of course not what we actually want to accomplish. We don't want to just find stuff. We want to make sure stuff is protected. And so I mentioned this a little bit ago, the language disconnect. So by people just shouting stuff out, if I was to say I had a high-risk vulnerability, or this SQL injection was high risk, what would that mean to somebody? And please just shout out. Okay, so first one was highly likely that somebody would be able to use or exploit the SQL injection. Anybody else? Okay, so it might mean that there's some kind of data exfil there. Anybody else? Big impact on the company. All right. So thank you for those. So all three of those things are technically probably right in this context. However, our counterparts in the organization, they end up using these kind of terms. If you think about finance teams, they use risk and threat and stuff in very specific ways. And our industry is one of the only ones, at least that I know of, obviously because I work and live and breathe this stuff, but we don't conform to the definitions that other kinds of teams or other professionals have for these particular definitions, and we also don't even agree on them within our own industry. So if we can't agree on things within our own field, and we have, let's say, 5 security professionals on a particular team, and they're all thinking about risk and threats in a different way, and we can't uniformly communicate that to an executive who we're expecting to allocate budget towards something, you're gonna have a really hard sell on your hands. Give me 1 second. All right. And so one way to get around this, and I'll explore this a little bit more later, but is to bridge the gap and say, if finance is going to be measuring risk in terms of expected loss, so combining likelihood and impact, and do a little bit of modeling. So you'd say that SQL injection has a 25% chance based on where it's located in the application, and it either does or does not need authentication to take advantage of. Maybe it has a 25% chance of being exploited or utilized within the next 6 months. And if that SQL injection is actually successfully used, it could cost us between $50,000 and $1 million. And with those 3 simple parameters, you can very easily model and say, here is the actual expected loss of this particular vulnerability. And then you can measure that expected loss against some kind of proposed budget. So if it's going to cost a developer, 5 hours of their time, and you can really easily roll that into production, then that's a really easy change. However, if that same thing, like if you walked into a system like I walked into initially, and you couldn't actually make a change to the application, and let's say your expected loss was $75,000 after all things being modeled, and your remediation cost was going to potentially be several $100,000, then it's a more interesting business decision, and we can't necessarily just come in screaming and saying my issues are more important than the business's issues, because at the end of the day, it's all money. All right. So the next thing, I mentioned this a little while ago, but we're missing our macro. So we hyper focus on those technology and social issues, but in many ways, we don't really consider tackling the problem of security within our organizations from these other potential angles. So, the way that we hack on office politics, can we integrate legal into our discussions and get them on our side or rallying to our cause? Can we potentially, like as I just mentioned with the risk scenario, can we start to bridge the gap with economics and speak more to our finance teams who may want to allocate budget to our cause? And then security is a business problem. So as of right now, I mentioned this at the beginning, but we have this emerging trend of, CISOs are demanding a seat at the executive table. Security teams want to be a part of the business discussion. We are framing security as a business problem. However, our actions do not really support what we say we want. We continue to heavily support, condone, and endorse very, very technical research. We don't support inclusiveness in many cases. And we're doing a lot of stuff in a security vacuum. We're not doing a lot of stuff with business leaders, hand in hand. And if we want to be a part of their solution, then we have to meet them where they're at or prompt them to come to us. And so where we want to go. Is anyone here familiar with Peter Drucker? Anyone read his stuff? A few folks? Excellent. So Peter Drucker is this management consultant guy, and he has this quote that I really, really, really like. It is the best way to predict the future is to create it, quite simply. So what we mean by that is if we want to be a part of the business discussion, the business problem, frame security as a business issue, then we have to start creating situations within our organizations that allow us to do that. And that's where I'm going to dig into these three particular techniques. First one, this is focused on the business process reviews. So the CIA, they declassified this simple sabotage field manual a few years ago. And basically, if you read it, it is basically their manual or their set of standards or guidelines on instigating a completely hellish bureaucracy within some system that they want to disrupt or influence or control or something to that effect. And when we started digging into our own business processes, we ended up finding a lot of really wonky things. Like some of the principles in there are, try to instigate as many meetings or get as many stakeholders in the room to make any kind of decision possible. Has anyone ever been in a meeting where somebody wanted to pull in 30 other people to make a decision to something? I know I have. And what happens in that situation is you either never arrive at some kind of consensus, and that thing never ends up getting done unless you kick it down the road. And 6 months later, you bring it up and try to, you either hope that those other people are out sick or you don't include the people who originally proposed bringing 30 others into the room, something like that. So by reviewing or threat modeling, if you will, business processes or the things that make our organization run, we can get ahead of this kind of stuff. We can stop letting these messes happen to us. And we also get a chance to have a lot of really thoughtful discussions with the business process owners. The next thing is we bring our red team hats into the boardroom. So I can think of a lot of things at Nuna in particular that could completely derail our company outside of, hackers in organized crime hackers in Russia or China, et cetera, or, the run-of-the-mill script kiddies. There are many adversaries come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. They might be competitors. They might be regulators who are creating some kind of policy or something like that. For our particular situation, we actually ended up wargaming POTUS before he came into office regarding healthcare policy. And because that potentially impacts a big part of what we do. And so we sat down and we red teamed it. And it was a really productive exercise. We ended up, discovering or identifying a number of different things that he might do relative to healthcare policy and mapping out our potential responses to those things. And all of those things are risks to our organization. And I got a lot of face time, or our security team got a lot of face time with all of our senior executives who were having that discussion, who this is very, very real and relevant to. And then, of course, we spread the love. And so a few things that I think are really relevant in terms of spreading love are social engineering and threat modeling, two of the more fun things that we do as security practitioners. And I want to talk about, and I'll highlight this later, is engaging very specific, I'll use specific examples or teams within an organization, but getting them on board with these kind of things. And the point there being, you can rally more people to your cause, or even rally more people as supporters to your cause. So that way, when there's multifunctional or multi-departmental budget discussions happening, you can have folks potentially throwing chips in your corner and backing you up if you say you need more funds or resources allocated to your cause. So, first thing first. So figuring out what's important. So as in any good security assessment, we need to first get a lay of the land. We need to figure out who the key players are. We need to figure out what makes them tick. We need to map out where money is going, who the influences are, things like that. And that requires reconnaissance. So how do you find these things out? Here are some ways. Your org chart might be a good start. Looking at who's making company publications or pushing out new material or sending out the most company-wide emails, things to that effect, or just being out and talking to people. Figuring out who is making the decisions and who is really driving things is really, really clutch. And you can just take notes of all those things, map those people out, and then when you have that list of people, their departments, maybe who works for them, who they report to, et cetera, you can start to pull together some of the things that are relevant to them from the things that they're publishing. Maybe that's OKRs or KPIs that they've committed to, or that their team has committed to. Maybe that's what their last 10 emails have been about, things to that effect. But map all of this stuff out as you would in any kind of social engineering or security assessment where you're preparing and doing your reconnaissance and figuring out what's relevant and where you actually want to test. Because you can't test everything, as you guys know. But, you want to spend your time where it's going to have the most impact, where you're going to drive home the biggest win. So next thing. That was quick and easy. We know where we potentially need to start. That was step one. The next thing is actually digging into some of these business processes. So the way that we started this, and I mentioned this earlier, is that this is basically threat modeling for business processes. If you're to map out flowchart style, a business process like onboarding a new user, which is an important thing, or providing a new access request. I'm sure we're all quite familiar with some of the breaches that have happened where somebody just has, or some system has, too much access to some set of resources that they don't need. Or they changed teams or changed departments or left the company and that access was never removed. Things to that effect. And so mapping these things out very clearly, you can see who's involved, maybe what data relative to some classification is flowing through that business process, what systems or vendors are involved. Maybe there's a decision point that needs to be made and how that potentially happens. And you can start to overlay threats and controls and things like that on top of these business processes. And let's say you have, from your initial research, you've identified, maybe your time is best spent in one particular department. Like maybe everything kind of flows through there. Then maybe you start there and identify maybe what that department's top 10 business processes are. Like what makes them tick, what makes them run. And from there, start to map this stuff out. And if you have, let's say their top 5 business processes have a lot of controls in place, like not everything you're going to need to step in and swoop in and save the day, but maybe their top 5 are very well guarded, and maybe their latter 5, they have one control each, and maybe those controls are policies or procedures. And I'm sure we're all familiar with that oh so great feeling where you publish a policy, nobody reads it, nobody follows it, nobody implements it, and you're just kind of dead in the water, pointing to the policy and saying, well, we wrote this thing, it shouldn't function this way, it is functioning this way, so you're in violation of XYZ. So ultimately what we want is to actually create tangible, maybe technical controls or procedural controls, something to that effect. We want to codify in some form or fashion controls that get us above and beyond simple policies. And when we did this at Nuna, we were initially really concerned. This was more of an experiment for us, but we were initially really concerned about inadvertently taking on a lot of ownership of stuff. We didn't want to end up owning user onboarding and offboarding. We didn't want to own data access requests and approvals. We didn't want to own system maintenance for systems that were not even relevant to us, et cetera, et cetera. But as we engaged with these people and we just helped them think through their problems, we found that we weren't actually, we as a security team, we were wasting a lot of time, and we did this, when we did this on ourselves, we were not keeping our house in nearly as proper order as we expected we were. But the teams that were having these assessments done to them, they were also much more engaged, and they didn't want to give up ownership because they had a clear roadmap once something was mapped out and modeled in terms of how they could make it even better, how they could improve, et cetera, et cetera. So we got to be the ones coming in and helping, but not necessarily coming in and owning. And of course, that is not necessarily some kind of law that would be universally applicable, but it is something that you would want to, if you do engage or apply this tactic, you would want to be very aware of not taking on ownership of all these things, because that will further overwhelm your team, and that's exactly what we're trying to get away from. We just want to be advisors. And then maintaining the thing. So in our particular case, we ended up just creating, I want to say like draw.io diagrams or something. We're moving to something that is actually codified right now. And so we can script out what a business process looks like and overlay controls and such on there. But we create it, initially whiteboard it, then model it, overlay threats, overlay controls, overlay breakpoints and risks, et cetera, onto our diagram. And then we give it to the owning team, the owning department head, whoever is in charge of that business process. And we keep record of that. So we have just links to everything. We have a little bit of an internal database, and we would go through and, periodically, like every 6 months or so, we just ping them quickly. Hey, just wanted to check in. Has this thing changed really critically? We know it's something that's really big for you guys. Let us know how we can help. And it gets them thinking about making sure that they're actually maintaining a process. Some things that we found when we went through this in particular, like the regular updates, is that offboarding, user offboarding for contractors or employees was something not being frequently updated. And we had to kind of insert ourselves into that a little bit and help keep that updated and make sure that all systems that were not integrated into Active Directory were being included in this offboarding process, because, of course, we don't want, somebody leaving the company and them retaining, why does this keep doing it? We don't want them retaining some kind of access after they leave the company. That is, of course, a bad thing, and in violation of some HIPAA and high trust compliance stuff that we're subject to. And as you have all of these risks, one of the great things that you can do here is going through that same kind of risk assessment process we talked about earlier. However you do risk assessments at your organization, but through this, you will end up identifying a whole bunch of risks, a whole bunch of potential issues. And because not just security issues are not the only things that can affect in a negative fashion our organizations, you can walk them through the things that scare you relative to that business process. You can walk them through how you would gauge how important something is and have a really productive conversation about it. All right, so moving into wargaming, something a little bit more fun and exciting. So the way that we approach this, and there's a million ways that you could have more of a tabletop slide-based exercise. You can do full-on role-playing, et cetera, et cetera. We ended up taking the role-playing approach and found it worked pretty well. And basically what we did is we took some kind of business strategy, some kind of tactic that we wanted to apply, some product we wanted to roll out, something to that effect, or the healthcare policy situation that I mentioned earlier. And we want to answer a couple of key questions initially. who are the adversaries relative to this particular scenario that we're going to model, and why might they want to? Like, why are they adversaries? Maybe it's more institutional, like a regulator is going to create policy and create legislation and such, or maybe a competitor might be entering into a new market and, they're just trying to expand their market share or roll out a new product or something to that effect. What are they willing to do is a really key question. So sometimes they might be willing to create a price war with you, for instance. They might be willing to hire a bunch of your key people. They might be willing to go to conferences and start collect competitive intelligence from folks from your organization who are also attending that conference, something like that. And then most importantly, what are we going to do about it is the thing that you answer through and after the war game. So after you model all of these situations, you want to have some kind of plan so you're not caught with your pants down when and if something happens. So in actually executing these things, I would recommend picking a single strategy to model at a time. These things can get really, really complex, even in a more simplified tabletop exercise. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of people who are not necessarily super familiar with the security thought process or with these kind of processes in general. And so you'll likely have questions. You don't want that much complexity all rolled into one. For instance, you might want to model, how do we introduce this new market, or introduce our product to this new market, or expand our product with this new feature, versus how do we make our company profitable? That might be too big and grand because there's so many factors to take into consideration. And then as you're building up your team of participants, I'd recommend not picking super, super senior leadership. And the reason I say that is they're going to have a lot of position power. They're going to have a lot of influence, as you might imagine. If your CEO walks into the room and they say something, everyone is likely to jump when they say how high. And so you want more middle to maybe, between middle and senior management, not like VPs and such, to be driving these things, because that's where a lot of the boots meet the ground action is actually accomplished. And so get a very diverse team of participants together, maybe people from product, IT, recruiting, et cetera, and get them all together. Prepare them, brief them in advance, give them some kind of briefing for the teams that they might play, whether it's their role playing a particular competitor, whether they're role playing a legislator, whatever. You want them to in a way, get into character. And let them act and play out actions as though they are that particular stakeholder, or adversary in this case. And when you actually hit the ground running, the way that we've done this, and again, there's a million ways that you could structure this, so pick whatever is best for you. But we would start by having the home team or the Nuna team present our initial solution or present our initial strategy. And then each team sits back, they understand it, they internalize it, they have a little bit of time to plan because they didn't know what that was specifically going to be. And then they put together, through the character teams that they're in, they put together their responses to that particular strategy. And have each team go through and present a rebuttal in terms of how they would respond to this particular rollout of strategy. And then you can do as many rounds as you want in terms of, all right, basically play chess with it. So we did this was their counter move, this is how we're going to move again, and you can go back and forth. I would recommend like 1 to 2 rounds, and then you can start to talk about it and talk about strategies. Yeah, question. So the question was, and correct me if I didn't get this correctly, was, have I ever done any kind of war game with an angry network engineer in the room? Or I have not. I can imagine how that could potentially get a little sticky. And keep in mind that, like, as you're picking these kind of teams or forming these kind of teams, you would want people who are going to be engaged and not overly hot-headed, et cetera. I mean, we definitely have people like that, who are very passionate will use the term, but you would. Okay. So the question was, just to repeat for everyone, whether we had war games, more of like an insider threat, a disgruntled employee. I see. We absolutely have, yes. I thought you were talking about a participant in the game. I'm sorry. So in terms of like our own security team simulations, we'll typically do this via tabletop exercises and complement it with like scanning data and things like that, so we could see just how prevalent somebody's access is. So we would get more of a, like, the briefing for that would be more geared around. Okay. All right. We'll talk more about that afterwards. But yes, this next one. So spreading the security love. So I mentioned this earlier. Social engineering and threat modeling, I think, are great ways to engage other people. And basically, this is all about getting them excited about security techniques, security tactics, etc. And so one thing I've seen applied pretty successfully is open source intelligence. So getting people who are going to conferences prepped on how some kind of adversary might creep on them, basically, and give them potentially those tools to creep on others. If you're talking about salespeople, they use the same kind of vernacular that we do in terms of breaking into an organization. They'll say breaking into an account. And so there's a lot of overlap in terms of what we can teach them about how to potentially do their job a little bit more efficiently and effectively. Of course, ethically and all of that. And then, if you are staying in line with the social engineering theme, if you are preparing people to go to conferences and go and start engaging with others, how do they frame their narrative so that they can make the best impression? How do they get the information that they want, get to the yes, etc. You can have conversations with them about body language, about like language analysis based on somebody's Twitter account, so they can send really effective emails. That's basically a spearfish, things like that. My wife is actually in sales, and we creep and do all sorts of funny stuff like this. I'll point you guys to some sites afterwards if you're interested. And I'll skip over this because of time. And if anyone wants to chat more about this stuff afterwards, please let me know. But concluding remarks. So none of this is not necessarily a step-by-step, play-by-play thing that is going to get you instantaneously a seat at the executive or board table. The real point of all of this is to change the way typically security teams work in a push information flow model. We're constantly pushing stuff out, pushing new policies out, pushing vulnerabilities out, and we want to drive change that way. We want to be able to flip the script a little bit and change it into a push and pull. So people are pulling us into conversations, pulling us into planning sessions, etc. And how do we instigate those kind of flows of information? And so really quick, three quick things that I think would benefit everyone here. And whether you're just getting started in your career and you do this on a smaller scale, or whether you're a senior executive or director, etc., and you're doing this across an entire organization. But first thing, set up meetings or set up some kind of discussion with people outside of your immediate purview. Set up one-on-ones, take them out to lunch, take them out to coffee, etc., and start to understand what is important to them. Find a way to play some kind of war game, simulate some kind of business process. Whatever it happens to be, find some kind of situation, get people excited about it, and if you can, try something out. Even if it's not a big coordinated role play game, even if you just put a couple of crazy ideas in a slide deck and walk through, what happens if our corporate Twitter account gets hijacked? What next? And just keep asking, what next? If this, then what? And have people walk through those. Those can be very, very informative. And then I'm a big fan of the what gets measured gets managed. So set some goals for yourself. when I first started this out, I made very small quantitative goals for myself. So setting up meetings with X number of people outside of the security and engineering teams. Play one game, war game in the quarter that's more focused on a business problem versus a technical one. Excuse me. And through that quantitative goal setting, you have to be ready to, at some kind of regular cadence, reassess and analyze how you're doing, and of course, iterate on your own process. So you want to be improving and figuring out ways that you can realign your goals, reset your goals, so you're always getting bigger, and your presence is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're pulling more and more people in. And I'm going to end on that. Please come hunt me down afterwards. I'll be here the rest of the day, and thank you very much.